Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, we proudly bring to you Mormonism Live!
Shut up and sit down.
Welcome to another episode of Mormonism Live.
Hi, Bill Reel. How are you doing?
I am exceptional, my friend. I saw somebody was posting about the Newark Holy Stones. I'm going back to church on Sunday.
That was my friend Donald.
Yeah. Just really quickly, I just want to point out the irony. So Donald, and I put the comments up there at the beginning. Let's see here if I can find it. He says that we're going to try to point out that Joseph Smith copied stories from the Apocrypha, and correlation doesn't mean causation. But then Donald says these were stones that were found among the Hopewell Indian ruins that had the 10 Commandments written on them. Isn't he making the same argument that correlation means causation in his view?
Well, only a benighted person such as yourself, Bill Reel, would think that, because correlation does not mean causation when it hurts Mormonism.
Oh,
it only means causation when it supports Mormonism.
What's the panic in somebody when they put 5 or 6 comments up before the show even starts?
I don't know, but I didn't know that you were going to try and tell anybody that Joseph Smith copied some things he copied, but we're going to be talking about some definite correlations, connections, similarities. But I don't think you're going to be arguing about causation when it comes to Judith. Are you?
No. In fact, I think there are places that there are stronger evidence, and we'll touch a few of those, that there's stronger evidence of plagiarism than the Book of Judith. I think Judith could be seen as that. I think there's a deep correlation in thematic elements of the story and in some personal pronouns or whatnot in the story. But I'll just leave it up to the viewers to decide which way they think. I did want to touch base before we got started, RFM.
What is this?
This is Marriage on a Tightrope t-shirt. And here's one for Rammy-umptum Ruminations.
Oh my gosh.
And we have had a gift shop that we tried to kind of operate ourselves under Mormon Discussion Incorporated, but Exmo Shirts, a great ex-Mormon company. Exmo Shirts does a lot of ex-Mormon merchandise, and they've got different categories, but they now have a new category for Mormon Discussion Incorporated, and all of our umbrella of podcast are there. And so you can go to exmoshirts.com, and on the left-hand side, all the way at the bottom there, you'll see Mormon Discussions, and folks can, and there's only a handful of things in there, but he's going to put some mugs on and get some other stuff. This gift shop gives us a better percentage back. The other gift shop that we were using used Shopify and some third-party company that didn't know us, and they were only giving us like $2 a shirt. And in this instance, we're getting significantly more. So folks, if you do want to support us, or you want to just wear merchandise from the various programs that we do, you can go buy a Radio Free Mormon shirt. I've asked him today, by the way, to print a shirt that said Radio Free Mormon on the front, and on the back it says Mormonism makes liars of us all.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you. Because I was going to remark that I noticed that there was one of your podcasts that was not represented in the shirts that you showed the audience to see.
Yes, and I did reach out to him and say, we've got to get a logo for each of them. So he's working on that. This just kind of broke in the last week. So we're kind of making sure that store is updated. Another one I told him to do, this one has to do with Maven, who, by the way, I don't see her in here now. So, but there's a shirt that says Mormonism. I wanted to say Mormonism Live on the front. And on the back, it's kind of long, but it'll say, for Helen Mar Kimball's sake, I hope there's a heaven, which was what Maven said in the episode about Joseph Smith's polygamy with Lindsay Hansen Park.
Yes, and she said something else about for Joseph Smith's sake.
Yeah, I don't know what that one. I forget what that one was.
She says, "I hope there's a hell."
I hope there's a hell for Joseph Smith's sake. Oh, I'll tell you one more little funny thing, and we're working on a shirt that'll say this: "But emancipate your mind." Wants a picture of the temple, and it is, oh my goodness, I forget what it was. It was International House of Handshakes. That's what it was.
Oh, yes. I think I've seen something like that before.
Yeah, so that's kind of funny. All right, I don't know where Maven went. Hopefully she's restarting her computer, but we'll kind of get started without her.
She's probably
any
madly ordering T-shirts as we speak.
That's what she's doing, probably. Any thoughts from you before we begin?
No, but I'm very excited about tonight's show because it's one of my favorite things, which is textual analysis and comparison.
Yeah, and I thought we'd start by talking for a moment about, I think it was Anthony Miller who coined the phrase eclectic aggregator in regards to Joseph Smith, and it might have been Terrell Givens who said it first. But this idea that Joseph Smith, and I, by the way, I agree with this. I think you do too. Whatever happened to create the Book of Mormon and to create the other works of sacred text that Joseph Smith did, he in some brilliant way collected themes and materials from his milieu and combined them to create something. In this case, I believe pseudepigrapha and a lot of theology. But it really is amazing the amount of stuff that we can find traces of in other places. And we'll talk about some of those tonight, but I think it's quite incredible.
Oh, I agree. Well, the eclectic part I get, because if you have furniture in your house that's eclectic, then it's all sorts of different styles and patterns and everything. And that's sort of what Joseph Smith did, at least according to Anthony Miller, according to Terrell Givens, who, if he doesn't use the exact expression, says the same thing when he writes about Joseph Smith, that he's taking from here, from all sorts of different places, putting it together and coming up with this new thing called Mormonism.
Yeah. So I thought we would start by sharing a handful of places that it feels sort of safe to say that Joseph Smith was borrowing from somewhere in his environment. And the first one I think is an easy go-to. This is the Joseph Smith Senior Dream. And I kind of am attached to this particular one, if only because at Family Pawn, we have a first edition of that Tissue of Lies, as Brigham Young called it.
You have a first edition? You mean you have one of those that wasn't destroyed on Brigham Young's orders?
Yeah. So if I remember the story right, there were Lucy Mack Smith, back in Nauvoo, prints this biography of her family, the progenitors of, Lucy Mack Smith and this life story of Joseph Smith, the prophet. And the production of that book, the first edition, was actually made in two different sizes. There was a bigger one and a smaller one. And the smaller one was what the ordinary folks who didn't have access to money. I'm going to cough here. Give me 1 second.
Take your time. I didn't know that there was two editions.
Yeah, and so there were very few of the big one to begin with, but there were a lot of the smaller one. And when Brigham Young called it a Tissue of Lies, he ordered the saints to destroy them. And almost all of them ended up being destroyed. There's not that many left. And so this little book, it's the first edition of it. We have it for sale for, I think, $7,500. It's an expensive book. Yeah.
That's an expensive tissue.
It is. It is an expensive tissue of lies. So in this dream, I don't want to spend a ton of time on these because we've got a story to get to at the end, but just to point out some of these, the similarities, Joseph Smith Sr., let me say back up a minute. Lucy Mack Smith records several dreams of Joseph Smith Sr. And one of these dreams is strangely, deeply similar to the Tree of Life story in the Book of Mormon, where Lehi has a vision and Nephi gets the interpretation thereof. And the similarities are just, they're so overwhelming that there's no ifs, ands, or buts, that you have two choices. Either A, Joseph, well, I guess you get three. Lucy Mack Smith's memory could be biased based on the fact that she's overwhelmed by the story in the Book of Mormon and she's misremembering her husband's dream. That's one possibility. Second one is that both Joseph Smith Sr. and Nephi and Lehi get the same vision, essentially. And the third one is the most likely, rational, reasonable conclusion, which is that Joseph Smith is heavily borrowing from his dad's dream and inserting it into the Book of Mormon.
Can I give a fourth alternative?
Say that again?
There was a fourth alternative, I think.
What is it? I don't know that.
Oh, it's that Lucy Mack Smith remembered the dream being told by her husband, Joseph Smith Sr., but that the timing is wrong, and he actually told it after the Book of Mormon came forth. Did you cover that one already?
No. But again, you'd have to have more conjecture for that one, right?
Right. The fact is, she puts it in Joseph Smith Sr., the dad's mouth, telling it to the
Yeah.
family prior to
Yeah.
the Book of Mormon coming
Like
forth.
1816 or something like that.
Yeah, much earlier. And so one of the things about this, which is so interesting, is that the dream of Joseph Smith Sr. and the dream of Lehi, as recorded in 1 Nephi 8, are so similar that not even the apologists, to my knowledge, are trying to argue, oh, it's just coincidental.
Yeah. So just to give some examples, you've got a desolate field representing the world, a narrow path, a river of water, a rope running along the bank of the river, and it functions in the exact same way that the rod of iron does, a tree with dazzling white fruit. Joseph Smith Sr. desires that his family should partake of the fruit, a spacious building filled with people who are mocking those who eat the fruit. Joseph Smith Sr. and his family ignore the mocking. The fruit represents the love of God. The building represents the world. And so, and there are very few dissimilarities, although there are some. And I just don't think dissimilarities prove anything. We talked about that off the air, and we'll talk about that when we get to a big one here with Fair Mormon. But there is the Tree of Life vision in the Book of Mormon, which closely approximates the Joseph Smith Sr. dream, and at least on some level, again, the reasonable, rational conclusion here is that Joseph is plagiarizing from Dad's dream. There are other options, and I leave it up to anybody to make an informed decision about how they want to rationalize that. The second one is Joseph Smith's Bible revision, and we already have BYU itself. By the way, this is BYU, Journal of Undergraduate Research, Professor Thomas Wayment, and then Haley Laban, who we had on Mormon Discussion years ago. They did a bunch. Oh, you're unmuted. I'm sorry.
Yes, right after she graduated from BYU and was in the clear and able to talk publicly about her research.
Yeah, in fact, we recorded the interview about a week and a half before she graduated and then released it after she did, so she wouldn't be in any trouble with the school and get her degree. But through the process of her research with Professor Wayment, she essentially lost her testimony over this issue. And what they learned, and you can see it here from my highlighted section, direct borrowing from this source. This is Joseph Smith heavily, I want to say plagiarizing, but they like the term direct borrowing, from Adam Clarke's commentary, which was a Bible commentary that was in contemporary to Joseph Smith's day. It was one of the most popular Bible commentaries, and lots of people had it. And BYU here with Haley Laban and Thomas Wayment says direct borrowing from this source, meaning the Adam Clarke commentary, because they mentioned it just above, has not previously been connected to Smith's translation efforts. And the fundamental question of what Smith meant by the term translation, notice there we have to start changing that word, with respect to his efforts to rework the biblical text, can now be considered in light of this new evidence.
Which is a very nice way of saying that it appears that he was borrowing comments made by Adam Clarke and then incorporating those into some places of his Joseph Smith translation, correct?
Yeah. And there was one more little quote in this paragraph, and then I wanted to read something from the next one. Just not seeing it. But in the next paragraph, our research has revealed a number of direct parallels. They're simply too numerous and explicit to posit happenstance or coincidental overlap. The parallels between the texts number into the hundreds, a number that is well beyond the limits of this paper to discuss. It is so evident that he is taking from Adam Clarke's commentary. And then you and I have talked about this numerous times. It's just a note for the viewer. There's always this argument when Joseph's translating that the witnesses are never talking about any other sources being used. And so apologists often jump on that to disprove the use of other sources. And we just want to note here that Adam Clarke's commentary seemingly was used extensively and nobody reported on it. And so it certainly opens up the door that Joseph is using other sources in other productions that he calls translation. And we would then be able to understand that maybe there's another reason why we don't know what other sources are being used. Simply a note. But just to note that they are in the hundreds. Even the church and Professor Wayment all agree now at this point that rather than the old view that there was a corrupted form of the Bible and parts were lost and Joseph restored it to its perfect form, The reality is that what we now know, and the church would agree, is that Joseph Smith used Adam Clarke's commentary extensively to create meaning and theology, and to add and subtract in his revision of the Bible. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and I would also add that it's the Bible itself is reproduced in this commentary, which is multiple volumes of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And at the top of the page, you have passages from the Bible. And then at the bottom, well, 3/4, it depends on how much, but it's a lot more of the page, is the commentary with footnotes that Adam Clarke provided. Now, what's really interesting is that the Bible that Joseph Smith had also had, in addition to the Old and the New Testament, and here's the segue, which I think is about time for, right, Bill?
Yeah.
About 14 books in the middle, which are called the Apocrypha with a capital A, which are, I think it's 14 books. It may be able to vary a little bit around there, but basically 14 books, intertestamental books that are included in the Bible of Joseph Smith's day. It's not going to be in your King James Version that you get at Deseret Book. That's just going to have the Old and New Testaments, not the Apocrypha in it. I do have an NRSV, which does have the Apocrypha as well. And the interesting thing to me is that when Joseph Smith was going through the Old Testament as part of his Bible translation, which I think he started in 1830, and then it went through 1833 or so by the time he got through the whole Bible, he comes to the Apocrypha. Apparently, after he's done with Malachi, he's done with the Old Testament, he comes to the Apocrypha, and he asks the Lord if he should translate or provide commentaries, what we call now, on the Apocrypha. And the Lord answers him, and this is in Doctrine and Covenants.
By the way, I love that. You've told us that what the church really means by translation is commentary.
And that's what they say now. You know,
Amen.
When I joined the church, and I was fascinated by the Joseph Smith translation, and I read everything I could about the Joseph Smith translation and the scholars. Robert J. Matthews was the kingpin on that, and he wrote the most on it. But it was always presented as Joseph Smith is restoring plain and precious parts that were removed or lost from the Bible, right? I mean, that was the whole presentation.
It was a big deal to you and me. Yes.
It was that was what the Joseph Smith translation presented itself as being. But now that we're seeing that that's not the case, now it's changing to being a commentary, which strangely enough is exactly what Adam Clarke's Bible commentary is, and on which Joseph Smith relied in providing his commentary on the Bible in the Joseph Smith translation. But if we go down to Doctrine and Covenants, section 91, I think, I'm going from memory, I'm scanning through my notes right now. Doctrine and Covenants, section 91, he asked the Lord, and I'm not sure I even have it in here, so you can look it up. You may know the story. And the Lord says, well, look, there's many things that are true in the Apocrypha, but there's some things that are not. So whoever reads it needs to use the Spirit to discern, but you don't have to translate that right now. You get a pass, Joseph, on translating the Apocrypha. And I was talking with Brian Hauglid a couple of years ago, because I don't have the Adam Clarke Bible commentary. He does. And I asked him, I said, Brian, can you check your Adam Clarke Bible commentary for a second? He said, sure. I said, does the Adam Clarke Bible commentary have the Apocrypha in it? And Brian looked and he came back and he says, no, it doesn't. And I said, well, isn't it interesting if Joseph Smith is relying on the Adam Clarke Bible commentary to do his Joseph Smith translation, that when he comes to the Apocrypha in his Bible that doesn't have any commentary from Adam Clarke, he doesn't have to translate that.
Yeah. If Adam Clarke doesn't comment on it, Joseph Smith doesn't want to comment on it.
It seems that way.
That is strange. Good point. I'm glad you brought that up. All right. And we will get to the Apocrypha, which is kind of the meat of the conversation tonight. But I wanted to pull a few other ones in. The next one, let's see what I got here. This is Emanuel Swedenborg. Maybe it's Swedenborg. And I actually have the late war before this, but we'll do this one first. Emanuel Swedenborg in the Three Kingdoms of Glory. And I want to note some of the things that are said here. Let me get rid of this and we can read a little bit of this here. So at this point, one might ask if the notion of heavenly degrees of glory was not uncommon in Joseph Smith's day. But again, this is the Doctrine and Covenants, Revelations in Context by the church itself. This is BYU.
Is that Andrew Hedges' name?
J.B. Hawes is the writer here, and then they're commenting on the Doctrine and Covenants, Revelations in Context. Andrew Hedges, Spencer Fluman, and Alonzo Gaskill.
Okay.
But J.B. Hawes is the one writing this section here for the BYU Religious Studies Center.
Okay. So a good LDS scholar.
Correct. At this point, one might ask if the notion of a heavenly degrees of glory was not uncommon in Joseph Smith's day, why focus so much on the question of Swedenborg's influence? In other words, there's so much of three kingdoms of glory in Joseph Smith's milieu. Why do we focus on trying to find a connection between Emanuel Swedenborg and Joseph Smith's theology?
Two questions. Emanuel Swedenborg, did he live and write before Joseph Smith?
Yes, but I'm trying to think if anybody's got his birth date, or one of you guys can look it up really quick. I've got too many windows open.
I can look
myself.
It up.
But yeah,
I know the answer is yes, but I was asking that.
Yeah, I know that for sure too, but I don't know the exact years.
All right. So he was, have you already gotten that, Maven?
Yes, I'm showing Emanuel Swedenborg, born February 8th, 1688. So, and died March 29th, 1772.
So any writing he was doing was completed well before Joseph Smith was born.
Yeah, and we get a cool connection here. So I'll read the quotes, and then I want to tell you how we know that Joseph Smith was familiar with this stuff. And actually, the way Joseph Smith words his response, and the response is secondhand, but the way he words his response, we get a pretty good idea that he's deeply intimate with Emanuel Swedenborg's teachings. So it says, at this point, one might ask if the notion of heavenly degrees of glory was not uncommon in Joseph Smith's day, why focus so much on the question of Swedenborg's influence? Two responses seem relevant. First, the prophet apparently mentioned Swedenborg by name during an 1839 conversation with Edward Hunter, a student of Swedenborgianism, who later became a Latter-day Saint. Hunter had established a seminary dedicated to the free exchange of religious ideas, and when Joseph Smith stopped at this Nant meal, I don't know what that is, seminary in Pennsylvania, during a return trip from Washington, D.C., Hunter reported this exchange, quote, I asked him if he was acquainted with the Swedenborgers. His answer, I verily believe Emanuel Swedenborg had a view of the world to come, but for the daily food he perished. In other words, I'm so intimately familiar with this that there were concepts that are far-reaching and brilliant and beautiful, but generally the little stuff from moment to moment, he's missing the mark on, right? And so that kind of an answer says there's some deep, intimate awareness of what Swedenborg was trying to put across.
Right. And when he says that he is aware of Swedenborg's views regarding the world to come, that's talking about heavens and the three heavens that were posited and taught by Swedenborg.
He's admitting he understands the three kingdoms of glory.
I have a connection to this. You just let me know when you want me to pop in on that.
Oh, yeah. Say that. Say what you want to.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and throw this up on the stream. So this is Brynathan in Pennsylvania. If you guys remember, that's where I served my mission, was the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania mission. So this was in my area for quite a while. And so this is a cathedral. It is Swedenborg, and they have it's really unique in that they decided to make it very organically. So instead of making everything to the square and all of the windows the same size that would, make construction easy, they made everything completely different. So there's no window that has the same measurements, even like the spires that you see. Everything that looks even and equal is actually not. Let me go. This is just another thing here. You can see on the right, there's these little curly cues in this door, like those were all hand done. They're all slightly different. And at the bottom, those are the keys to every single door in that building. They were all made with a completely different lock and a completely different key. They literally made every single thing in that building slightly different sizes, but it looks normal.
What a pain to be a janitor.
I know, right? Sorry, Bill, I accidentally took you off there. Anyway, so I went on several tours of this building from people who believe this, and I was interested to learn, and I hadn't heard any of this before, that they believe in kind of three heavens. They had a pamphlet that I had taken, and they also believe in eternal marriage, but they just do it like here in this cathedral part, no temple ceremonies or anything, and they just kind of leave out the till death do you part. But there was that and some other similarities that I thought was interesting. And actually, I think if I go back, if I recall correctly, these are prophets in the stained glass over here, and they guide, again, this is over 10 years ago, but what I remember is them telling me that there was a belief that there would be like one last dispensation with a prophet in it. So of course my companion and I tried to maybe put out the idea that maybe that was Joseph Smith. She was not interested in that, our tour guide that day. She wasn't picking up what we were putting down, I guess. But anyway, yeah. So
you guys were working your cause and effect in reverse.
Right. There we go. So yeah, I did think it was interesting, and of course there was kind of a little bit of knowing that he was older, and having these 3 degrees of glory, or not of glory, but these 3 different versions of heaven. And I remember at the time I justified it by thinking, if Emanuel Swedenborg was very close to the Lord, but it just wasn't time for the last dispensation, I thought, there's no reason why God can't also give him, this same vision that we have, that we know is true. And so that's how I kind of justified it. It was, one of those, this actually increases my testimony kind of a thing, where it obviously shouldn't. So that's my story as far as Swedenborg goes.
That's a great thing we do as Mormons. We essentially hit the mark and then draw a bullseye around it, huh?
Yep.
It's a great story, and I will tell you that if those things and those teachings had been found in an ancient text buried somewhere and not discovered till after Joseph Smith was dead, the apologists would be having a field day with it. But when it shows up in writings of somebody who lived within a century before Joseph Smith, in writings that Joseph Smith had access to, all of a sudden the apologists get really quiet.
Yeah. Notice the last sentence here. If accurately remembered, this remark generates a whole range of questions. Of course, I don't think they're going to lay out all those questions, but
I can think of one.
Yeah. Second, because both men described a heaven that consisted of specific and separate realms, there seems to be a greater qualitative correspondence in their respective views than in the more nebulous many mansions type of heaven found in the writings of other contemporary theologians. Again, this idea of many mansions is in the milieu of Joseph Smith. McDonnell and Lang trace the roots of the modern heaven, at least in part, to Swedenborg, and see echoes of that modern heaven in Mormonism. And then the last one might then ask, would Latter-day Saints even be troubled if it could be determined that Swedenborgian ideas did influence Joseph Smith? And then just leave it hanging, right? Like, what would Latter-day Saints do if this was a direct correlation between Swedenborg's theology and Joseph Smith utilizing it, 50 years later?
I have a hypothesis as to when Joseph Smith became aware of these ideas.
When do you think?
Sometime between 1829, when he dictates the Book of Mormon, which has very much a one heaven, one hell kind of theology, and February 16th, 1832, when he and Sidney Rigdon receive Section 76, the vision of the kingdoms of glory. So I think I've narrowed it down to a 3-year window.
Yeah, when he encounters it. Yeah, I think you hit something, the proverbial nail on the head. So there's that one. The next one I wanted to go into was the late war. I don't want that. Where are we at here?
Look at all those tabs you have.
Oh, I know. I got to make sure I get the right thing though. Let's see.
You are such a lazy learner.
I am. The late war. There were some that I found here. We'll just go through a little bit of them. So the late war, it tells you the chapter of the late war on the left. It tells you the chapter and verse of the Book of Mormon on the right. You get like small band, fought desperately. And some things are just similar. Slaughter was dreadful. They did administer death unto all who opposed them. 2,000 hardy men, 2,000 of those young men who were called volunteers because they fought freely, entered into a covenant, weapons of war, defend their country, fought freely for their country. Men of dauntless courage, valiant for the courage. And again, it's not to say, the easy out is to say Joseph Smith plagiarized all of these sources. I think in some cases he may have. I think in some cases he probably did. And I think in some cases it's the kind of language and thematic elements that are found all throughout Joseph's milieu in various stories and books that were popular in his day. And so he hears these themes, reads these books, hears these things over and over, and there are things that kind of sit in him to kind of pull from when he does the book. And I think that feels like a stretch, but there are so many interesting people throughout world history who have done things along the same kinds of lines that I think we ought to at least recognize Joseph Smith's brilliance, because I don't think he's just an uneducated farm boy, and to give him some credit. And I think Joseph did soak up a lot of information. You and I, when we're talking about Mormonism, you and I on almost any subject can pull out facts and dates, things that correlate with the topic that we're talking about in ways that I don't think most people can. And I think Joseph Smith had that same kind of ability with the things that he was interested in.
That's interesting, an interesting analogy. I will tell you that the late war, for me personally, I don't see this as any kind of a smoking gun at all. It may not even be an unloaded gun, but there is just this sort of similarity of language and presentation between the two that makes the presentation and language of the Book of Mormon look less unique than it would otherwise.
Correct. It is interesting to note, the Book of Mormon uses that Kurlams and Qumams, and I'm probably pronouncing those wrong, but Orson Pratt.
How could we tell?
I don't know, right? How could we tell I'm pronouncing it wrong? Orson Pratt indicated that Kurlams were mammoths, and he did that in the Journal of Discourses, volume 12. And the late war talks about mammoths and elephants as well. Again, I'll pull a few more of these out. I'll skip this one, but there's some other ones that I thought were interesting. Let me make this bigger and go back here. Just a little note here. This was a analysis of word usage in various books that would have been contemporary to Joseph Smith, as well as other books he would not have had access to, or highly unlikely that he would have had access to. And as you can see my cursor there at the bottom, a very flat line at the bottom would be an exact match with the Book of Mormon. So if we go up just a little bit, the very bottom there. So if we go up just a little bit, the Book of Abraham and the Book of Moses, two productions that were also by Joseph Smith, have the most similarity to word usage of the Book of Mormon. But the very next ones are the first book of Napoleon, Book of Commandments, which we would expect, first book of Napoleon, and then the late war, both an 1816 standard edition, and then they have an 1816, what they called a clean edition. I don't know what that meant, but both of those tend to be the next, that book tends to be the next book with the closest word usage to the Book of Mormon. And just to give some examples, other examples of it, they both mention the 4th of July, the fourth day of the 7th month, which is fourth day of the 7th month, which is Teancum, the Moravian town. Notice the people of Morianton, a very similar word. And it came to pass, the army they were under, whom they called Tecumseh. This one's Teancum. Slew him. He fell to the earth. He was dead and had gone the way of all the earth. That's a pretty similar two sets of quotes from two different people. That's a really similar thing. 2,000 hardy men. We talked about this one. Valiant for courage, dauntless courage. They talk about the Americas, the land of gold and silver, all manner of creatures. And here it says animals, which were used for food, right? Talks about the mammoth. Here it talks about Kurlams and Qumams. And again, Orson Pratt says that was mammoths anyway. They talk about forts that were prepared, swords, weapons of war, great slaughter, immense slaughter, ditches in both. They're slain and they're wounded. They're dead and they're wounded. It's just the similarities are actually quite striking to me. I don't think my rational brain, again, I could be wrong, my rational brain looks at this and the similarities seem stronger than I think apologists would like to argue. Does that make sense?
Sure.
It came to pass on the 10th day of the 8th month. It came to pass on the 10th day of the month.
By the way, when people are listening to this without watching the screen,
Yeah.
you're like saying the same phrases over again. And
Yeah.
the first time you're saying it from the late war, and the second time you're saying it from the Book of Mormon, correct?
Right. And really, I would suggest, if you're listening to this, I really would suggest to go look at the video of our conversation, because you're going to see these images on the screen. The similar phrases and words are highlighted with the same colors. And so you can really quickly point out, it just seems strange that in these same spots over and over, there are 3 or 4 common themes in each section of the writing for both the late war and the Book of Mormon. They build their strongholds on the 10th day of the 8th month, round about the city. I mean, it's just in the same sections of each book is this language that's deeply overlapping. Casualties, they talk about the Liahona, by the way, made partly of brass with curious works, like unto a clock, and as it were a large ball. That was the late war. The Book of Mormon, a round ball of curious workmanship instead of curious works, and it was of fine brass, and within the ball were 2 spindles. A clock has 2 spindles, right?
Yes, like the big hand and the little hand.
You got it. Weapons and weapons of war were of curious workmanship, and weapons of war were exceedingly curious workmanship. That's a strange phrase to find in both books, don't you think?
Well, it is curious.
They both pitched their tents. It came to pass that they gathered together their army, their navy, in the borders of the land. It came to pass that they gathered together all their people, their flocks, near the borders of the land. So lots of similarities. I think there's one more. Chief warriors, chief captains, people to rise up against their own children, against their brethren. Go with all your might against their city. Yeah. So anyway, there's that. Now I wanted to show something else. This is only tangentially connected, but this is a second site that goes over each of those similarities. You can read those some other place. What is this, my friend? What is that?
Well, it looks like a chiasmus.
It is a chiasmus. This is one in the late war that has 21 pairs. This is similar to Alma 36 in terms of the size of it. And notice, by the way, that no one would argue that the late war is of Hebrew origin. And yet we have this really big chiastic structure in the late war. And so this would be a great example of being able to dismiss chiasmus in the Book of Mormon.
Wow.
Yeah, that's kind of cool.
That's disappointing. By the way, I will note that on the page that you just showed, it has the publication date of this book, The Late War, of 1816, correct?
Where are you seeing that?
Right above and to the right of the chiasmus image you had.
Oh, okay. Let's see here.
That's important to know. Oh,
yeah, here we go. 1816, yes. So before Joseph Smith's day.
In New York.
In New York. Isn't that strange, huh? So anyway, just the fact that chiasmus does show up in products that are contemporary and are not at all trying to look Hebrew, and they're still there. So maybe not as strong of an evidence as we thought. So that is please.
While you're going on, can I go back to Swedenborg for just a second?
Please.
Because Dan Vogel was saying something about the 3 heavens and that Swedenborg didn't teach that. I think that's what his comment said. Anyway, I just went to the Wikipedia page. I am not familiar personally with the works of Emanuel Swedenborg, but according to this, it says that some, including Mormon historian D. Michael Quinn, have argued that various parts of the plan of salvation were influenced in part by Emanuel Swedenborg's book, Heaven and Hell. In Heaven and Hell, Swedenborg wrote that, quote, there are 3 heavens, unquote, that are, quote, entirely distinct from each other, unquote. I feel like I'm talking in general conference. Swedenborg called the highest heaven, guess what, Bill?
The celestial kingdom.
Yes, and he also stated that the inhabitants of the 3 heavens corresponded to the sun, moon, and stars.
Sound
familiar?
That's interesting. Yeah. Is that 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 29, maybe?
I think it was, well, it might be. I just actually closed the window.
Or 15:29. I think it's somewhere in there.
Because that's what Richard Bushman hypothesized, was that both Swedenborg and Joseph Smith were influenced by Paul's talking about one who was caught up to the 3rd heaven.
Yeah.
That's one place. And then the other place talks about the bodies of those who inhabit the heavens, right? The celestial and the terrestrial.
Yep. So there's a really good document there. We'll put the links in with the show and you can go back and read all of this, but there are tons of connections. By the way, Samuel Mitchell, who was the other gentleman that Martin Harris met, if I'm not mistaken, maybe I'm saying that wrong.
I think that's right.
And wasn't there another guy by the last name of Smith as well?
Well, I'm not sure, but you're talking about his trip to New York when he famously met with Charles Anton.
Charles Anton. There is some suggestion in here that it was Samuel Mitchell who perhaps connected the late war to Mormonism or whatnot. And just to note that, but we can move on from that. I didn't read it thoroughly, and so I don't want to comment without being wrong here. So I wanted to say the last one I wanted to point to, which I think is the most demonstrable of all of them, is this section from Matthew. And so this is evidence of translation or plagiarism. So this is Joseph Smith having pieces of the Book of Mormon. And this isn't the only one, but this is a really good one to use as an example. There are many places in the Book of Mormon where the language used is coming from a source in the Bible that the Nephites and Lamanites and Lehi and all of those people should not have had access to. And this one's a great example of that. So Mormon, verse 924, keep in mind that that Nephi and Lehi and their family come over during Old Testament times, and they don't have access to the New Testament. And we actually run into an even more serious problem as we read this. But Mormon 924 and Mark 16, verse 17 and 18 are the exact same language. And these signs shall follow them that believe in my name. Shall they cast out devils? They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. But it's worse than that. It's not that Mormon or Moroni are using language that they shouldn't have had access to, because the argument we could make is that the New Testament author and the Book of Mormon author both are inspired by the Lord to write the same thing. But the problem with that is that Mark 16:8 is believed by biblical scholars to be the last verse that whoever the author of Mark is, it's the last verse that he actually wrote down. And that later authors added to Mark. And we know this because the earliest manuscripts of Mark end at Mark 16, verse 8. And so everything from verse 9 to verse 20 is not believed to be original to the New Testament, or to, I shouldn't say New Testament even, because we don't combine all those works together till later. But the book of Mark itself would have ended at verse 8. Anything after that would not be original to the Gospel of Mark. And so we end up with exact wording of what is almost assuredly a later addition to the book of Mark. And that, to me, again, if you're going to be a rational thinker, there really isn't a healthy way to explain that without making allowances and conjecture. Any thoughts on that one?
Right. And so plagiarism is really a loaded word. And so I'm glad that you're not using it for other things up till now. There may be influences, possibly echoes. But here is where we get into the area, I think, that can fairly and reasonably be described as plagiarism. And as you say, the long ending of Mark shows up virtually verbatim in the Book of Mormon. There's not going to be anybody who's going to look at both passages and say, no, these are not the same. This is just a coincidence. And in fact, there are two other places in the Book of Mormon where a similar thing happens, and that is in Moroni, chapter 7. Let's see here. There was actually a paper that was done on this issue by none other than Sidney B. Sperry, a very faithful, erudite LDS scholar from some decades ago. And this paper was reproduced by the Neil A. Maxwell Institute, and it was printed in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies back in 1995. That's not when it was originally written, but that was republished there. But the title of it is Literary Problems in the Book of Mormon Involving 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and Other New Testament Books. Because without going into all the detail, the problem is that you have a lengthy passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 13 that shows up in Moroni chapter 7, and you have another lengthy passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 12 regarding the gifts of the Spirit that shows up in Moroni chapter 10, the last book in the Book of Mormon. And they are so obviously the same that even Sidney Sperry doesn't try and argue that they're different. He tries to say, well, we have to go to Revelation. that there's no reason that the Lord couldn't reveal the same words to people in the Book of Mormon as he revealed to Paul. But really, I think the more rational explanation is simply that Joseph Smith, when he had the Bible open, and we know he had the Bible open because he's quoting from Isaiah, although the Book of Mormon identifies it as Isaiah, so we cannot call that plagiarism because the citation is given. He quotes the Sermon on the Mount, but once again, I think plagiarism is too strong a word, because I believe Jesus says in 3rd Nephi that he's teaching the same things that he taught to his disciples in Jerusalem, made a little bit more problematic by the fact that scholars agree that there never was any Sermon on the Mount that was given. It's just a collection of aggregate and disparate teachings of Jesus that are all kind of glommed together to create one sermon. But regardless of that, it doesn't qualify as plagiarism because it is cited. But when you get to that long ending of Mark, when you get to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, when you get to 1 Corinthians chapter 13 showing up in the Bible with in the Book of Mormon, with no attribution, and it's clear that they are virtually identical, I think plagiarism actually is a fair word to use there.
Yeah, and as you're pointing out, we've said this multiple times, Sidney Sperry and the incident that you're recounting, he's doing the same thing that apologists have done forever, which is to walk the issue back until it's indiscernible from a fraud, right? When you enact a catalyst theory, which is the same idea here with this, you are essentially saying, I know it looks like a fraud, but if we just make the allowance that thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from each other, that Heavenly Father at 2 different times is giving 2 different prophets the exact same quote to say. You essentially, if it is a fraud, you've essentially given yourself an out to make it at least have room for a faithful view, but you make it impossible for anybody to discern the difference between a fraud and a faithful conclusion because they look exactly the same.
Yeah, I think translation digs Mormonism into a hole and revelation gets you out free again.
Yeah, look at that. Which is why they're now in the middle of changing the word translation to revelation.
Yes.
Huh. Good job. All right. So the next thing I wanted to talk about. So those were 5 examples of deep similarities, perhaps thematic borrowing of some sort, or at least awareness in Joseph Smith's mind. And I think at least a couple examples in the instance of the Joseph Smith Sr. dream and the ones we're talking about right now with terms of scriptures in the Bible that are also in the Book of Mormon that shouldn't really be there. Those similarities shouldn't exist, not without, again, adding a ton of conjecture. Those seem to be more like plagiarism to me. And if we go from there, I want to make the argument that Joseph Smith absolutely had use of the Apocrypha. And the easiest way to do that is just to go to an LDS source. This is Doctrine and Covenant Student Manual, section 91, the Apocrypha. Right here, the Bible from which he was making his corrections contained the Apocrypha. That's on its own telling, at least by the time 1833 happens, Joseph Smith has a Bible that has the Apocrypha in it, but it's really much worse than that. So here's the data. Joseph Smith purchased a Bible in the late 1820s. Joseph Smith Family Bible was an 1828 version with the Apocrypha, and even the LDS Church admits he was using it when he created his Joseph Smith translation. He also later on, I think, buys an 1831 copy of the Bible that also has the Apocrypha in it. So
for the JST.
Yes. What? Say that again?
For the JST.
Yeah. So he has at least in the 1820s through, he has at any given moment, he has one, and sometimes he has 2 Bibles that both have the Apocrypha in them. And we can see that too, by the way, from this here, Joseph Smith Family Bible goes on sale. And so, let's see here, locked up in his safe. He said an 1831 edition of the Bible was originally purchased by Joseph Smith when the family lived in Kirtland. And they talk about in this article how it had the Apocrypha in it. And so we know that that is the case. So we know Joseph Smith had the Apocrypha available to him. As you pointed out, Adam Clark decides not to give a commentary on it. So Joseph Smith tends to want to stay away from giving his commentary on it, which I thought was a fabulous point made by you. There was one other thing I wanted to say before we get into the meat of this. The surviving evidence favors the conclusion that Joseph Smith was influenced directly by the Apocrypha. As a reader of the Bible, Joseph would have encountered the Apocrypha during personal or family reading of the Bible. Those experiences are now rather difficult to trace, but the presence of several names in the Book of Mormon that have parallels to unique names in the Apocrypha suggests that these apocryphal names may have influenced Joseph in some way. These names, these places, these events might have become part of Joseph's vocabulary, surfacing perhaps randomly in the translation of the Book of Mormon. Again, there's a lot of subjection or conjecture there. But at the very least, we have to own that from about 1828 or 1829 forward, Joseph Smith is using a Bible that has the Apocrypha in it. Any thoughts there before I continue? You're muted again. Sorry, my friend. You're still muted.
Dang it.
There we go.
Okay, sorry. Thank you. No, just that when you're saying there's a lot of conjecture there, what I hear is careful scholarly language that's saying, hey, this isn't ironclad, but there's a lot of interesting connections and similarities.
Yeah. Now, I want to start with the question's already been asked, by the way. We're not treading new ground. I didn't find this in the last couple of weeks and decide I wanted to talk about it. Rather, this issue has been around, and we know that because, for instance, if we go to Fair LDS now, I think it was fairlatterdaysaints.org. So it used to be Fair LDS, then it became Fair, then it became Fair Mormon, and now it's Fair Latter-day Saints. So they changed their names about as much as I changed my underwear. Hopefully I changed mine a little more, but it's close. So the question here, did Joseph Smith create the story of Nephi and Laban by plagiarizing concepts and phrases from the story of Judith and Holofernes in the Apocrypha? I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Oliver Cowdery purchased a Bible containing the Apocrypha in October 1829. By the way, there's Fair admitting the same thing, that Joseph Smith and the early church were using at the forefront a Bible that contained the Apocrypha from at least 1829 on, and maybe actually there's some debate about whether it was October 1828 or October 1829, after the Book of Mormon was already at press. In order to support these claims, I just want to note this, in order to support these claims, it would be necessary for Joseph to have obtained a Bible containing the Apocrypha during the period of translation. It is known that Oliver Cowdery purchased a Bible in October 1829. However, the Book of Mormon was already at press by this time, with the copyright being registered on 11 June 1829. We do know that Joseph had a Bible containing the Apocrypha in 1833 during the time he produced the Joseph Smith translation. Doctrine and Covenants, section 91, was given to Joseph specifically in response to his question as to whether or not he ought to revise the Apocrypha. So I'm gonna at least side with Fair and say there is some debate about whether Joseph Smith would have had access to the Apocrypha at the very time that he is writing out the story of Laban being beheaded. By the way, we should note here that while we read the Book of Mormon starting with the Book of Nephi, the first and second book of Nephi, the reality is that we understand the way the translation worked is 116 pages. It's lost. Joseph Smith picks up after that, finishes the Book of Mormon, and then the very last thing that he is translating is the first and second book of Nephi, and the next couple of things up until whatever, Omner and Omni, correct?
Yeah, I don't know about Omner, but yes.
Yeah.
Jacobinus Jeremiah.
That the translation of the first and second book of Nephi would have come at the end of the translation.
Right, and you know who we can thank for coming up with that theory, which is generally accepted among LDS scholars?
Is it Skousen?
Brent Metcalf, baby.
Ooh, look at that. Brent Metcalf.
On the show last week with Dan Vogel.
Those lazy learners, huh? So just to note that, because I think that's important to this conversation, because again, there is some debate whether it's 1829 or 1828.
And I'm sure the apologists want to have it after 1829. But when you get to 1829 versus 1831, you're cutting it pretty close there, I got to tell you. And the similarities tend to persuade some people that, yeah, it's pretty obvious that he was aware of the Apocrypha and had read them prior to his translation of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, again, the argument too is that Joseph Smith growing up had a Bible, familiar with the Apocrypha itself. We can't prove that, but again, that seems to be a reasonable conclusion based on what Bibles were sold at that time, what they contained. At what point did the Catholic Church and some of the Protestant churches begin to see the Apocrypha as not useful or not to have it around? And so that's another argument for another day, but at least to note it.
And that's and I think that's really the Protestants. The Catholics continue to print their Bible with the Apocrypha, I believe.
In it, yeah, kind of as a separate, little less weight to it, but it's there, correct?
Yeah, it's the Apocrypha is not considered as authoritative as the Old Testament or the New Testament, by which I understand is meant that it's useful for reading and for spiritual understanding, but that no doctrines should be based upon the writings of the Apocrypha if they're not found anywhere else in the Bible.
Yeah. I will say before we get into the meat of this, I didn't go and read the Book of Judith all the way through. I didn't go and read First Maccabees or Second Maccabees. I really don't have an interest in sharing with our audience tonight the full gist of that story. If you did, you're welcome to share it. But before you do, I want to ask you a question.
Are you talking to me?
I am. I'm talking to you.
Oh, okay.
So Fair Mormon says that the story of Judith and Holofernes and the story of Nephi and Laban actually have more dissimilarities than parallels. The two stories, essentially, they want to focus on the dissimilarities. So in their website, they go through and list things that are different. And it's strange because some of the things they list, it's like the other story has the exact opposite. So for instance, does not intend to kill Laban with the intent to kill Holofernes, right? And I want to ask you, RFM.
That's so different, Bill. That's completely different.
I know. I want to ask you, if you were going to plagiarize something for a project at school, a report, you're going to copy from a book directly, because you're a smart guy, how would you carry that out?
I am so smart that, I already did this. I mean, I did that in high school, right? And I think I've told this story once, but the whole deal is that I read this book, this little short story called The Monkey's Paw. And everybody should know what the monkey's paw is. I had never heard of it before, but I was fascinated by this monkey's paw, right? And of course, the guy gets 3 wishes, and the first wish sort of gets wasted on $10 coming in the mail. And then the second wish has to do with, what does the second wish have to do with? Oh, yeah, because their son, the son of the parents, right, gets killed in a horrible industrial accident. And then his mother wishes, it's such grief, wishes him back from the grave. And it's a dark and stormy night. And they start hearing some lumbering thing shuffling up the sidewalk outside the house. And the wind is howling and the storm is raging and it's coming up the front steps. And then it's banging on the door. And the mother rushes to open the door. And the father, who has a lick of sense, grabs up the monkey's paw, uses the third wish to wish his son back in the grave. And the mother opens the door to greet her son, and there's nothing there. Yeah, so it's creepy. I'm getting chills just even, talking about it. But that's the monkey's paw. So I loved it, right? I didn't know it was one of the most famous short stories in history, but I've got to do an assignment in my English class, 11th grade. Mrs. Randall's was the teacher. And so I write a story that is the monkey's paw. But hey, I wasn't born yesterday. I'm not going to write it about a monkey's paw. I'm going to change it, and I'm going to make it a strange hexagonal black stone with curious carvings in it. And that's what I did. So it's the same story, right? But I put this rock in there. And I was shocked and chagrined when I got the paperback from the teacher, and it didn't have an A, it might have been a B, but at the end, she writes this little note in red ink, right? This story sounds strangely familiar. And I just looked at that in the library and I went, oh, busted.
Would the excuse of the dissimilarities have held up for you?
Well, no, not at all. Because, obviously you're going to take some things and change them a little bit, right? In order to
Joseph Smith wasn't, he's no dodo. He's read a few good books. He didn't go to school, but he did read a few good books. He's no dodo.
No, he's not. And I think he was at least as smart as I was in 11th grade.
Yeah. So to judge a plagiarism on the dissimilarities is not how anybody judges a plagiarism, is it?
No, but the deal is also that dissimilarity is the same thing, just in reverse with a not in it, right?
Yeah, right.
That-
If it's the opposite, right.
Yeah, Nephi does not intend to kill Laban, right? Even though those words are not in the story, by the way. That's a synopsis of the story. But Judith enters that camp with the intent to kill Holofernes. By the way, I can tell you the similarity in a nutshell, right? I think we all know that Nephi kills Laban while he's drunk, and that Laban is a military commander. He's a captain, I think, was it 50? I think that's what it is. He's a military commander, and Nephi kills him by cutting his head off with his own sword. Correct?
Yeah, he's the guard of he kind of operates the treasury, right? He's in charge of records, or at least they're in his care.
Right. And that, for my position right now, I'm just putting that to the side and just saying military commander, drunk, cut off head, own sword.
With his own sword.
Judith cuts off the head of Holofernes, a military commander who is drunk, with his own sword. No similarity at all.
Love it. So let's get into some of these similarities. Maven, I'm gonna let you I'll take mine down. And if you want to put yours up, and we'll go over some of these. Some of these we'll look at specifically, and then others of these I'll just kind of read kind of a caption, and Maven might have images for those ones, but we'll kind of move through those ones quickly. Both of them use the word Nephi. By the way, we have to pause here for a moment.
If you'll hang on a second. I'm sorry, Bill. That's Maccabees.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. So we're using 3 books here. There's the Book of Judith in the Apocrypha. There's also First Maccabees and Second Maccabees. Yeah. And the similarities are within those 3 books compared to First Nephi. And so in this particular, this is Second Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 36. They both mention the name Nephi. Now, if you're looking at the screen right now, you'll notice that it doesn't say Nephi. And we just want to note that is because this is a revised translation, and the name Nephi has been changed to Naphtha. But if you go back to older editions, the ones that Joseph Smith had, for instance, Maven just put it up on the screen. This, and we know this, by the way, this is the edition that Joseph Smith would have had access to. It absolutely would have called the place Nephi. So we have Nephi as a name used in Second Maccabees chapter 1, verse 36. Obviously, Nephi is a major character in the Book of Mormon. So there's one of them. And
not only is the name Nephi a person's name in the Book of Mormon, it is also the name of a place in the Book of Mormon. Is that what you're going to next?
Let me see here. Yeah, so the same idea. It's the place. So we have another one that does the same thing, Maven?
I don't know. Was that in?
That's okay.
Maccabees?
Second Maccabees 1, 34, 36. So it's right there above. Made it holy. But again, maybe this translation doesn't have it. So we can skip to the third one.
I think our audience is generally aware of the land of Nephi in the Book of Mormon, that it is also a place name.
And by the way, the naphtha is that connection to the word that's the chemical that's easily incendiary, you know, the gas that you can blow up. And so I wanted to at least point out that the word Nephi, at least in the Apocrypha, is not necessarily an Egyptian word, but rather it's a reference to this explosion kind of gas. And there's several discussions online if you want to go look up Nephthar or Naphtha and go see where the root of that word comes from. The third one I wanted to point out is that the name Laban occurs in both Judith and in the Book of Mormon. So here we have Judith chapter 8, verse 26, Laban, his mother's brother. And then, of course, we understand, you know, Nephi, that Laban is the person who has the record. Both Nephi and Judith were very devout servants of the Lord. Both stories speak of a wicked man who wanted to destroy God's people. In both cases, the people were in great fear. Both Nephi and Judith counseled their associates to be strong. And then here's one we'll put up on the screen. Both claim that God's strength did not depend on numbers. So here we have, your strength is not in numbers, nor does your might depend on the powerful. You are God of the lowly, helper of those little accountants, supporter of the weak, protector of those in despair, savior of those without hope. And it came to pass, that was the Book of Mormon verse. And it came to pass that I spake unto my brethren, saying, let us go again unto Jerusalem, and let us be faithful in keeping the commandments of the Lord, for he is mightier than all the earth. Then why not mightier than Laban and his 50, or even than his tens of thousands?
That first verse you quoted was from where in the Apocrypha? Is that Judith?
That is Judith chapter 9, verse 11.
Okay. By the way, just for the record, Laban, of course, is also in the Bible. He's the father of Leah and Rachel.
Yeah. So it's not the only place Joseph could have gotten that name, other than maybe Revelation.
Right. And Lehi does not show up in the Apocrypha, but does show up in the Book of Judges and the famous story of Samson picking up the jawbone of an ass and laying waste to all the Philistines. Lehi itself being another place name, and it being a play on words, because Lehi in Hebrew means jawbone.
Yeah. Both Nephi and his brethren and Judith and her maid went on a secret mission for the Lord. In both cases, the wicked man was delivered into the hands of the servant of the Lord. Here's one we'll put up. In both cases, the wicked man was drunk. So Judith was left alone in the tent with Holofernes, who lay sprawled on his bed, for he was drunk with wine. Nevertheless, I went forth, and I came near unto the house of Laban. I beheld a man, and he had fallen to the earth before me, for he was drunken with wine. Next one we'll also put up. In both cases, the servant of the Lord took hold of the wicked man's weapon. So this is Judith chapter 13, verse 6. She went to the bedpost near the head of Holofernes, and taking his sword from it, she drew close to the bed, grasped the hair of his head, and said, strengthen me this day, Lord God of Israel. And then Nephi says, and I beheld his sword, and I drew it forth from the sheath thereof. In the hilt thereof was a pure gold. By the way, it's dark outside. It is strange that Nephi notices how nice this sword is, isn't it?
Oh, it's very nice. I've commented on that elsewhere, which I won't go into now.
Yeah. By the way, I'll just say, as I prepared this conversation tonight, I ran into, I think, what we're talking about. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Yeah. I was tickled when I saw it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome, my friend. So in both instances, the hero of the story takes the sword from the drunken fallen person and then cuts off their head, right? In both cases, the servant of the Lord took hold of the wicked man's hair. In both cases, the wicked man's head was cut off with his own weapon. In both cases, the servant of the Lord returned to those who were waiting without being caught. Both Nephi and Judith made off with some of the wicked man's possessions. When the people learned of the success of the mission, they rejoiced in both stories. In both cases, the people offered burnt offerings of the Lord. We'll show this one too. Judith 16, verse 18, and 1 Nephi 5, 9. In the Apocrypha, it says, when they arrived at Jerusalem, they worshiped God, and as soon as the people were purified, they offered their burnt offerings, their voluntary offerings and donations. Book of Mormon says, and it came to pass they did rejoice exceedingly and did offer sacrifice and burnt offerings unto the Lord, and they gave thanks unto the God of Israel.
Very interesting. You know, the backyard professor is saying that the hilt glowed in the dark, and that's how he knew it was gold. I think the backyard professor is suggesting that perhaps orcs were in the vicinity.
I'm going to suggest that in the dark, you would have a hard time knowing whether it's real gold, but we should come to expect that. Moroni doesn't seem to know what gold is either. It could have been Tembaga or some other alloy, but he seems to think the plates were made of gold.
Yeah, right. That's a good point.
So there's a lot of Mormon prophets who struggle to understand precious metals.
Like Ziff.
They'd make horrible pawnbrokers, by the way.
Oh, really? Oh, of course they would. And you could tell us about that.
Just the fake gold that comes in. And, it sounds like both Nephi and Moroni might fall for it.
Were you done with the connections between Judith and Nephi?
No, I've got a couple others here.
Okay, go
Let's
ahead.
go to this one. This is both Nephi and Judith use a similar expression, tens of thousands. And so here we go. This is 1 Nephi 4:1 and Judith 16:4. And 16:4, Assur came out of the mountains from the north. He came with tens of thousands of his army. We have to use this one because the other source for Judith was actually missing this verse for whatever reason. But with tens of thousands of his army, and then notice the very bottom of verse 1 in chapter 4, or even then his tens of thousands. So you have this full phrase being used.
Now, my understanding is that that's a significant number, and I'm going off memory here, but I think 10,000 was the highest number that the Greeks had. So they didn't have a million. They had 10,000 as their top number. They could say tens of thousands, and that actually that Greek word for tens of thousands is our word myriad.
Yeah. Simply meaning a lot, a whole lot of people, right?
Yeah, tens of thousands.
Yeah. Anything above 10,000 was tens of thousands.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah. Both dwelt in tents. We've got just a couple more. So we'll go to this one, which is in both First Nephi and Judith. We find the word 3 days. We also find valley and to the tent of. This is First Nephi chapter 2, verses 6 and chapter 3, verse 1. And then Judith chapter 10, verse 11, verse 17, and chapter 12, verse 7. And so again, you have the phrase 3 days, you have the word valley, and the exact phrase of to the tent of. And then we'll do, let me read off a few more. In both First Nephi and Judith, we find in both accounts the servant of the Lord changes apparel. So you see that up on the screen right now. And if you're listening to this, you're watching it. I'll say watching it because listening, you're not seeing any of this. But if you're watching it, hit pause. Feel free to read these. Both Nephi and Judith used trickery to obtain the desired result. Both Laban and Holofernes were slain while others were sleeping. Both First Nephi and the Book of Judith contain a similar expression, left gold and silver and. That's First Nephi 3:16 and Judith 8:17. So you see silver, left her gold and silver, and then gold and silver, and all manner of other things. And they're also talking about all manner of other things, although they use a different set of words to explain that. The very first verse in Second Maccabees mentions the Jews in Egypt. The second verse in the Book of Mormon contains Nephi's incredible statement that the book would be written in the Egyptian language. The letter mentioned in the Apocrypha may have led Joseph Smith to conclude that it would have been acceptable to claim his book of sacred scripture was written in Egyptian, or better yet, Reformed Egyptian.
Right. He says the learning of the language of the Egyptians and the learning of the Jews is what Nephi says, right?
Yeah. And in the Maccabees instance, the brethren, the Jews that be at Jerusalem in the land of Judea, wish unto the brethren, the Jews that are throughout Egypt, health and peace. So he would have, at least if he read this, he would have known there was a connection between the Jews being in Egypt and being at least there living, and hence likely present with their society and their culture.
Yes, very good.
Yeah. Second verse of Book of Mormon, Nephi says he's going to make a record, speaks of some records which told of a commandment given by Jeremy the prophet. A 3-word parallels found in the records. In the first chapter of the Book of Mormon, Nephi says he's going to make an abridgment of his record. This is suspiciously like a portion of Second Maccabees. There's an interesting 3-word parallel in the two accounts. Make an abridgment, make an abridgment. And again, notice if you see a difference on the screen in the Apocrypha section, it's simply a revised translation issue. If you go back to the original, it does say the thing I'm claiming it says. But make an abridgment is the same in both stories. Both First Nephi and Maccabees refer to a treasury, plates or tables, and of brass, and the word commanded. And so those are some interesting similarities that are very close to each other. And two more, and then I will step away here. The reader will remember that 2 Maccabees chapter 3 contains a story about the treasury in Jerusalem and Heliodorus' attempt to plunder its contents. Laban's treasury was also in Jerusalem. Both Nephi, let's go down here. Where are you hiding? Both Nephi and Heliodorus had to travel to Jerusalem in their attempt to obtain access to that treasury. And then lastly, both Laban and Heliodorus were brought to the ground. So those are just common themes. And there's a lot of them. And again, I'm not saying that it's plagiarism, but there are enough similarities that it should at least cause us some pause. And we should spend some time maybe wrestling with whether there's enough there to see some overlap, that Joseph might have incorporated themes from the Apocrypha into his work. And it's not just here, as we're pointing out, there's other places, but Book of Abraham, you've talked about on many occasions, places where Joseph Smith is borrowing from, it seems to, or appears to be borrowing from Adam Clark's commentary. And then it's either the Book of Jasher or the Book of Joseph, one of the two that Joseph is using.
Josephus.
Yeah, Josephus. And then the Book of Moses borrows heavily from Matthew and Luke, both themes as well as word usage and certain quotes. And so it seems as though throughout Joseph Smith's translation productions, there is a lot of overlap with materials that were contemporary to his milieu.
Very good.
Any other thoughts?
Yes, Moses supposes his toes are roses, but Moses supposes erroneously. More to the subject, one of the things that's interesting about Judith, and by the way, I'm going from my nice red Bible, which gave certain people absolute fits when I would bring this in to teach gospel doctrine class from 2006 to 2010 when we were on the Old and the New Testaments. But they have introductions to the different books, which are then translated by the different scholars. And in the translation, the introduction to Judith, there's something really interesting that happens when she goes in and hacks off poor Holofernes' head, which is that she sneaks into his camp and then sneaks out without getting caught. Okay. And this is what it says in the introduction. Judith, a Jewish widow, so beguiles Holofernes, because she is a hottie, the invincible head of the Assyrian army, that's Holofernes, and all his servants and soldiers, that she is able to assassinate him in the middle of his camp and sneak away without being caught. Does that sound like anybody in the Book of Mormon to you, Bill?
Yes, only because you were talking about this story earlier, but I don't remember. Was it Teancum?
Yeah.
Teancum's
the one in the Book of Mormon who sneaks into the enemy camp and with his trusty rope and spear and kills Amalickiah in his tent and then sneaks away without being caught. Later, he tries the same trick with Amalickiah's brother, who has succeeded him as the leader of the enemy forces. And apparently, Amaron makes a noise when he's being killed and wakes up some people, and that was the end of Teancum. So I think that's really interesting.
There's a Mormon joke about Teancum, but I won't repeat it here.
There is?
There is. I won't. But people could look it up. You could look up Mormon joke and Teancum.
Really? I've heard a story about Ammon. You know how many of the arms of the Lamanites at the waters of Sebus, right? That he brought back to the Lamanite king?
Mm-mm.
An armful.
An armful. Look at that.
Okay. I hope the joke with Teancum is like more humorous, but
it is, but it's a little adult, so I won't share it here.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe after the show.
I don't want to hurt our PG-13 rating.
By the way, here's the thing: is that these connections, these similarities between different books, they're not, as Bill has said, conclusive of plagiarism. But these are the kinds of things that Bible scholars look at, and sometimes they'll call them echoes of another book, that there may indeed be a relationship between two different books. And a similar thing happens with the book of Matthew in chapter 22. And as most Mormons know, there's a story there about Jesus saying that in heaven they are neither married nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels in heaven. Well, the story that leads up to that is about the Sadducees coming before him and giving him this strange hypothetical, which you may recall. Let me see here if I can find it, or I could just synopsize it. I think everybody here knows what it is. Let's see. Verse 26 in chapter 22. No, starts in 25. Now, there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. So no children, right? The second did the same, so also the third down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, then, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For all of them had married her. That was the hypothetical they put to Jesus. And what it is noted in here, and this is the NRSV again, in the footnotes is down to the 7th, this woman who's married to 7 husbands, it says, echoes Tobit, chapter 3, verses 7 through 10. And Tobit is another book in the Apocrypha. And I just want to show you or read to you what it is that it says there and why it is that this particular scholar sees a potential echo.
What chapter is that?
Tobit chapter 3, verses 7 through 10. You have it there?
No, go ahead and read it. I'm just trying to find it here.
Oh, okay. On the same day at Ecbatana in Media, or Medea, whatever it is, it also happened that Sarah, she's the protagonist in this story, that Sarah, the daughter of Raguel, was reproached by one of her father's maids. You know why? For she had been married to 7 husbands. And the wicked demon Asmodeus, that's not Amadeus, we're not talking Mozart, we're talking Asmodeus, the demon, had killed each of them before they had been with her, as is customary for wives. So they had not consummated the relationship, ergo no children, as it says in Matthew. And so the maid said to her, you are the one who kills your husband. So she gets falsely accused of killing her husband. She's like the Black Widow. First she mates, then she kills. Or in this case, first she doesn't mate, but she kills anyway. But she's innocent. And it goes on to talk about how she's innocent. And I think is vindicated of that charge. But that's the echo that this scholar sees in the hypothetical brought by the Sadducees to Jesus in Matthew 22. So what you're doing here and what we're doing tonight is very common in biblical scholarly circles. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is a causation between the two, but there certainly is an echo there, and there may indeed be a reliance upon that story and it being transferred into the New Testament in Matthew chapter 20 and 2. So those are 2 things. There was one other thing I wanted to say because I actually just thought of it while you were talking, Bill. I'm so excited. Yes. There is a name that appears in LDS scripture that does not appear in the Bible, but does appear in the Apocrypha. And it's an unusual name. It's the name of an angel. And I'm not talking about the Book of Mormon. I'm talking about the Doctrine and Covenants. Doctrine and Covenants, section 128, verse 21, which all of a sudden, and without any context whatsoever or any backstory, I mean, in Mormonism, we know about Moroni, we know about Gabriel, we know about Michael, but all of a sudden, into the mix comes an angel named Raphael. Do you remember that verse, Bill?
No, but isn't Raphael supposed to be Noah?
No, that's Gabriel.
Well, it's Gabriel. Sorry.
That's okay.
I don't know who Raphael is, but yeah, you've got
nobody does. Raphael. Nobody has any idea because there's no backstory. He just shows
I know he's a Ninja
here.
Turtle.
Well, yes. And what are his weapons?
The 2 little swords, little daggers.
I think you're right. I don't know. I asked the question not knowing what the answer is. But okay, I think you're probably right. But anyway, and certainly a famous painter, an Italian painter. But again, the voice of God in the chamber of Old Father Whitmer in Fayette, Seneca County. This is Doctrine and Covenants, section 128, verse 21, in Fayette, Seneca County, and at sundry times and in diverse places throughout all the travels and tribulations of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. By the way, the voice of God in the chamber of Old Father Whitmer in Fayette, Seneca County may or may not have been the voice of God originally giving or pronouncing the Melchizedek priesthood upon certain men in June of 1831. That was the original story, remember, before it got changed to Peter, James, and John. Nevertheless, going on in the next sentence in the same verse, and the voice of Michael, the archangel, the voice of Gabriel, and of Raphael, and of diverse angels from Michael or Adam down to the present time. Okay. And then it goes on because it's a long
Where's
verse.
that Raphael coming from?
Well, I have no idea. It's a really strange thing because that's where it appears. It never appears before. It never appears after in LDS scripture, but it does appear and it's not in the Bible either. Okay. But it is in the Apocrypha, and it's in, once again, the book of Tobit, the same book that had that lady who sadly got married to 7 husbands, and each of them got killed by that demon on the wedding night. So let me see here if I can find this. Let me escape from that. Yeah, it's in Tobit, chapter 12, verse 15. And let me see if I can find that here. I'm looking at it on a screen. I've got all these things here in my way. Let's see, 12:15. 12:15. Here it is. I'm going to read 14. I was sent to you to test you. This is Raphael to Tobit. I was sent to you to test you, and at the same time, God sent me to heal you and Sarah, your daughter-in-law. Remember Sarah? I am Raphael, one of the 7 angels who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord. So it's in the book of Tobit in the Apocrypha that Raphael is designated as one of the 7 angels that appear before the Lord. Of course, Michael and Gabriel are 2 of the other angels, but they also appear in the regular Bible. So we have this interesting situation where we have Raphael appearing out of absolutely nowhere that we can tell in Doctrine and Covenants. It's not in the Old Testament. It's not in the New Testament. It appears as an angel in the Doctrine and Covenants, and it appears as an angel in the book of Tobit. I think the reliance on Tobit to come up with that name for an angel is pretty strong.
Yeah. The other thing, and just to note, maybe another piece of strength that would be a counterpoint to what you're saying, Backyard Professor is mentioning that the magic books that Joseph Smith had access to, for instance, I was looking behind me because on my shelf, I don't know how to pronounce it, but I'm going to say it's the Magus, Magus.
Yeah.
And it's the magic book that we know Joseph Smith had in his possession around the same time he's doing all this treasure digging and folk magic stuff. And Backyard Professor is pointing out that Raphael is a big deal in that book as well.
Oh, okay. Well, great. So, but not the Bible, somewhere else. A Bible. We've got a Bible, but the Bible doesn't mention anything about Raphael.
Yeah. Just so kind of to conclusion, I want to just note we've got the phone lines open. 662 Mormons with an S on the end, which is 662-667-6667. And you can dial in now, be on the show. We'll be happy to take your comments or questions. My thoughts is that when we look at the Book of Mormon, there's enough evidence of multiple things being used from Joseph Smith's milieu. The Book of Abraham has much of that as well. The Book of Moses has that. We absolutely know that the Revised Bible has that. And so the only other translation production that Joseph Smith did, if I'm not mistaken, is the Kinderhook plates. And that he stops pretty quickly. But in the 4 that were finished to completion, Joseph Smith, obviously the Book of Commandments or Doctrine and Covenants as well, but that's kind of a different project on its own because Joseph is acknowledging he's speaking with a modern voice and it's not an ancient text. And to have some overlap there, I don't think is as much of a concern. But the 4 translation productions I mentioned, there is in each of them significant, and with the Bible translation, it is overwhelming that Joseph is borrowing thematic elements from his environment, and those elements make their way into those translation productions.
Good point. Good point.
And then I just want to reiterate what I said in the beginning. I think Joseph Smith was brilliant and a genius. And where I think credit is deeply due is to acknowledge that whatever was going on there, and I don't believe in anything that was God-given, but whatever did happen there, I think Joseph Smith did an incredible job of taking just a plethora of things in his culture and mixing them into stories and in text that, for the most part, are consistent in their geography, consistent in their timelines, consistent in the people who are having the experiences as characters in the text. And how he did that, I don't know. And I wouldn't apply a supernatural term of miraculous to it, but in a secular way, I do think it was miraculous.
Right. And there are certain other things, of course, in the Book of Mormon that have obvious Bible parallels and sometimes seem to want to one-up the Bible stories. Noah has an ark in which he saves all the different animals and everything. In the Book of Mormon, that becomes 8 barges that the Jaredites have. In the Bible, Paul has this miraculous conversion from being wicked and persecuting to being righteous by an angelic appearance to him on the road to Damascus. In the Book of Mormon, we have Alma the Younger and the 4 sons of Mosiah, right? Got to one-up it. It seems like it's one-upped every time. But they have the same kind of encounter with an angel. Bam, they drop down. They were persecutors of the church. And then they come to, they're born again. And now they are totally good Mormons.
Interesting. I don't see any calls as of yet. I don't know if there's anything else that you're kind of thinking, but if anybody does want to call in, the phone lines are completely empty. We've got a bank of 3 calls that we can take at a time.
Well, it's been a while since I read Maccabees, but it's very, very interesting. And of course, there's the Maccabees was a family, sometimes called the Hasmonean dynasty, which is when Greece was the world power before Rome. This is in I think the 3rd century BCE, that the Jewish nation said, we're not taking this crap anymore from you Greeks. We're going to stand up and we're going to fight for our rights. And to everyone's astonishment, not least of all the Greeks, they won. And it was just absolutely remarkable. And they were able to establish for a time an independent Israel against the power of the Greeks. But then Rome comes along and they get destroyed and wiped out. But this is very fresh in the Jewish memory. This is about as far in history from the time of Jesus as the revolution, the Revolutionary War is from us today in 2022. So it's about the same time period before. And this is why so many Jews really believed that if they stood up to Rome and had God's help, then God could do for them what he did for the Maccabee family. And he could establish an independent Israel even against the power of Rome. Now, that was tried several times. It never worked out, certainly not in the long term, or not really even in the short term for the Jews, because they got crushed pretty bad every time they tried it. But this is something that fired their hopes and made them look for messiahs who would fill this role of a military leader to establish an independent Israel. And many of those put those hopes in Jesus, and those hopes were dashed as well when Jesus was crucified. There's a great story in Maccabees, and I can't remember who it is, but there's a very interesting method of execution of somebody. I think it was a good guy too. It's like there's this giant frying pan put on a fire, and they stretch this person out and bind him to the frying pan, and they just kind of fry him alive.
I hope before you pass away, I hope they come up with the technology to take all the data in somebody's brain and upload it to a hard drive, because I am continuously, I pride myself, at least with Mormonism, of knowing a lot of things. And you just, what you have inside your brain amazes me every episode that I've ever worked with you. So, well,
you're very kind. If you'd read a story about a guy getting fried to death, I guarantee you'd remember it too.
Maybe. I think you've forgotten more than I've ever learned. So
I don't know, but the story's making me hungry for some reason.
Yeah, look at that. I will note too, just one other thing in terms of plagiarisms. Brian Whitney, who is a scholar of Mormonism.
Oh yeah.
He worked for the church history department as an assistant while he was getting his education. And his job was to sit down with the sermons of the ministers contemporary to Joseph Smith. And I took a tour. Brian arranged for me to have a tour of the church history library. I met in person Mark Ashurst McGee.
Mm-hmm.
I met Stephen Harper, and I forget, there was a third person there, and I don't remember his name, but I met him, and he was a prominent historian as well. I was at Brian's desk as he was going through these books, and I sat there for 20 minutes as he was doing it. And he just said, Bill, you would be in awe of how many similarities there were in the sermons of ministers of his day, juxtaposed against the sermons of the characters of the Book of Mormon.
Yes.
And so that's another one. And
even
then
down to specific phrases, like "Song of Redeeming Love" is one.
Very much.
By the way, I'm sorry. I think that last comment that was put up there and was since taken down about Judith and about all the historical inaccuracies in Judith. Yes, the Book of Judith. I was rereading it and doing a little more research in preparation for tonight's show. It's like the different cities that she talks about, or that are talked about in the Book of Judith. You know, they don't even know what they are. They're guessing where they might be. And it seems very strange in a number of respects. But some scholars think that Judith got her name as a reflection or an echo of Judas Maccabee, who was one of the Maccabees who threw off Greece.
Yeah. And yeah, it seems like there's that connection. That's cool. That's an
It was
interesting
Paul A.
fact.
Douglas, there he is, who made that comment. And I just wanted to add that.
Love it. Love it. We've got 2 phone calls in the queue. The first one is the Backyard Professor. Carrie, what do you got for us tonight, my friend?
Hey guys, how you doing?
How are you doing, Carrie?
I
Are
can
you
barely
working
hear
on
you.
Sunday show?
I am. I really am. I've got some good stuff. Some clown named Dan Vogel wrote a good book, and I can't stop talking about it. No, I just want to say, seriously, tonight's show just really blows me away. I really had no idea that it. Granted, it's a numerous amount of parallels with Judith and the Book of Mormon, but like Bill has pointed out, the conceptual ideas involved in those parallels with the number, I can't help it. That seems impressive. Now, yes, Hugh Nibley was accused of parallelomania, so you guys are probably going to hear that from Mormons who bother to watch this, but I'm serious. I learned a lot of cool stuff tonight, so I just wanted to call and say thanks. This had to have taken you quite a bit of work to do, and I know in the chat there's been several of us saying just wow, so way to go. Another fantastic show. I love watching this show. I love being in the chat group. I love being associated with you guys. This is just spectacular. So thank you. Good show.
Carrie, I think it was about a half an hour on my part, probably a half an hour on RFM's part, and about 3 hours on Maven's part. So I think she put the work in.
All you. Yes, yeah. Give credit to Maven too. I love that little gal. She's awesome. She refuses to be a polygamous wife of mine, and I can't blame her. But still, she's awesome.
Oh man, let's hope they never bring the everlasting covenant back. You know.
Oh yes, I know, right? Ooh.
Not to mention the everlasting gobstopper.
On the other hand, it would really give us. It would give us great podcasts, though, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you, my
guys.
friend.
Thank you again. I'll see you on Sunday.
Okay, and that's Sunday at 6 p.m. Mountain Time when Kerry Schertz, as the Backyard Professor, presents his live podcast dealing with the Book of Abraham and his ongoing love affair with Dan Vogel.
Awesome. Have a great day, Kerry.
Good way to put it. I love that, man.
Take it easy. All right. And then we've got Sam. Sam is on the line. Sam, you're on Mormonism Live. What's on your mind tonight?
Sam.
Hey, you guys have just been talking about similarities from different works in Joseph Smith's day.
Right.
And one that I think is really cool is The Late War. Have either of you guys read that?
Well, we were just talking about it tonight, my friend.
Okay, I didn't catch all the show.
Yeah, no biggie. We talked about it early on, but there were a lot of overlapping phrases and quotes in that as well.
Did you talk about the gray hairs being laid down in the grave?
Mm-mm. No.
There's a part in the Late War that says the infirmities of his age have weakened his understanding. Therefore, let his gray hairs go down into the grave in silence.
So that's like what Lehi says, right?
In the Book of Mormon. Yeah, you know the part that I'm talking about.
It has the same phrase
There's a
to
part
it.
in the Book of Mormon.
Mhm.
Yeah, just about the exact. Well, I think it gets laid down in a watery grave because they're on the ocean, but kind of the same poetic language.
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I think the overlap at least
yeah.
should give us pause.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well,
I
thank you, my
assume you
friend.
guys also talk about.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
All right. And that is it. I don't have any more calls in the queue, so we can call it a night. We got to 8 o'clock anyway. Anything else from you, RFM?
Well, just First Nephi 18:18. Because of their grief and much sorrow and the iniquity of my brethren, they were brought near even to be carried out of this time, talking about his parents, Nephi and Lehi and Sarai, to meet their God. Yea, their gray hairs were about to be brought down to lie low in the dust. Yea, even they were near to be cast with sorrow into a watery grave, because they are on the ocean.
So there you go. So at the end of it, I guess we can decide to take the reasonable route and see that Joseph Smith is, at least in instances, plagiarizing, in other instances perhaps using common themes of his day. Or I guess our other option is
give Brother Joseph a break.